They thought Evelyn Shaw was just a quiet supply tech until Lieutenant James Dorn tried to expose her. He mocked her, called her a deserter. What he didn't know: she was Specter 6, the ghost op who vanished with intel that saved lives. Now the entire base watches as Dorn's authority crumbles and the legend rises. Stick around, because when the truth comes out, metals will melt and ranks will fall. Let us know where you're watching from and what time you found this. We read every single comment. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any videos. Lieutenant James Dorn's polished boots echoed through Fort Greystone's supply depot, each step a declaration of authority, as he watched Evelyn Shaw meticulously counting inventory. His fingers traced the lieutenant's bars on his collar, a habit born from 15 years of unquestioned command. The morning sun caught the brass, throwing accusatory gleams across the concrete walls. Still counting those bandages like they're gold bars, Shaw. Lieutenant James Dorn's voice carried the weight of suspicion, drawing nervous glances from nearby soldiers. The clicking of her counter ceased the sudden silence, deafening. Or should I say, Specter 6. The inventory counter clattered to the floor, the sound ricocheting off metal shelving like a gunshot. A young private's phone emerged, its camera lens catching the confrontation. Lieutenant James Dorn advanced, each step measured, deliberate. His shadow fell across Shaw's clipboard, and he savored the slight tremor in her hands. "Sir, I don't understand." Shaw's voice wavered, but something in her eyes, a flash of steel beneath the facade, made Lieutenant James Dorn's pulse quicken. He snatched the clipboard from her hands, sending papers scattering like startled birds. "Don't play dumb, Shaw." Operation Dust Light, ring any bells? Lieutenant James Dorn circled her, a predator closing in. Command's been looking for Specter 6 for 3 years, the ghost operator who disappeared with classified intel. And here you are hiding in plain sight, counting gauze and glucose. The depot had gone silent, the usual bustle frozen in anticipation. More phones appeared, recording. Lieutenant James Dorn could already imagine the hashtag, Watch Fort Greystone Showdown. His grip tightened on his service pistol's holster, a gesture of intimidation he'd perfected over years of command. "You don't belong here," he spat inches from her face. "Your kind, deserters, traitors, you're all the same. Think you can hide behind regulations and paperwork." But something was wrong. Shaw's posture had shifted, subtle, but unmistakable. The fear in her eyes hardened into something else: determination. Recognition flickered through Lieutenant James Dorn's mind like distant lightning. He'd seen that stance before in classified combat footage of Specter operatives. "Lieutenant Dorn!" A sharp voice cut through the tension. Colonel Hayes strode into the depot, flanked by MPs. "Step away from Operative Shaw immediately." Lieutenant James Dorn's world tilted. "Operative!" "That's right, Lieutenant." Colonel Hayes's words fell like hammer blows. "You've just compromised a 3-year deep cover operation. Congratulations on making it onto every intelligence agency's radar." The phones were still recording as Lieutenant James Dorn's authority crumbled. His lieutenant's bars felt like lead weights now dragging him down as Shaw, no Specter 6, met his gaze with quiet triumph. Have you ever felt your power questioned? Drop one if you've seen authority crumble. Lieutenant James Dorn's hands shook as he reviewed the viral footage. Dorn Down was trending, and the morning's confidence had curdled into dread. In the videos, he looked exactly like what he was, a bully with a badge exposed at last. And somewhere in Fort Greystone, Specter 6 was watching his world unravel. Lieutenant James Dorn's fingers traced the edge of his service medallion, its once comforting weight now feeling like lead against his chest. The security footage played before him on an endless loop, each frame eroding the foundations of his carefully constructed worldview. There she was, Evelyn Shaw, moving through Fort Greystone's combat room with a grace that spoke of years of specialized training, her movements precise, lethal, and hauntingly familiar. The base's constant hum seemed to mock Lieutenant James Dorn, now a reminder of his arrogance. How many nights had he dismissed the shadows moving across the compound, attributing them to routine patrols? Every supply manifest he'd questioned, every medical placement he'd criticized, they all bore her invisible signature. Specter 6's signature. "Sir, you need to see this." Private Martinez's voice cracked as he handed over another tablet. Lieutenant James Dorn's stomach lurched as social media feeds flooded the screen. Specter 6 was trending with leaked footage from the combat room spreading like wildfire. His own voice echoed in the background of one clip, his dismissive tone now preserved forever. Just another paper pusher trying to play soldier. The service medallion caught the fluorescent light, throwing accusatory gleams across his office walls. Lieutenant James Dorn remembered how he'd polished it just yesterday, proud of his position, certain of his judgments. Now each revelation felt like another nail in his career's coffin. Computer access supply requisition logs last 6 months. Lieutenant James Dorn commanded, his voice barely steady. The patterns emerged with devastating clarity. Medical supplies strategically positioned near units with the highest risk assessments, ammunition distributed with a tactical precision that spoke of combat experience far beyond standard protocol. She hadn't just been managing supplies, she'd been protecting them all. The security cameras continued their silent vigil, and Lieutenant James Dorn watched as past footage showed Evelyn's midnight rounds. She moved like a ghost through the compound, checking vulnerabilities he'd never even considered, reinforcing defenses he'd deemed unnecessary. Each discovery twisted the knife deeper. His phone buzzed incessantly with notifications. The hashtag was gaining momentum, and with it questions about his leadership were surfacing. Lieutenant Dorn's treatment of Specter 6 raises concerns about prejudice in military leadership. One headline blared. His hands shook as he set the phone face down. A knock at his door made Lieutenant James Dorn jump. "Sir," Captain Reynolds stood in the doorway, his expression grave. "Command wants answers about the leaked footage. They're particularly interested in your documented interactions with Shaw." The service medallion seemed to burn against his chest now. Lieutenant James Dorn's fingers wrapped around it, seeking comfort, but finding only cold metal and colder memories. How many times had he wielded his rank like a weapon against her? How many times had he dismissed her suggestions, her insights, her very presence? The base's hum grew louder, almost accusatory. Lieutenant James Dorn stood at his window, watching personnel scurry across the compound. Somewhere out there, Evelyn Shaw continued her duties, her true identity now exposed while his carefully constructed world crumbled around him. "Have you ever discovered your prejudices were completely wrong? Drop 2 in the comments if this revelation shook you." His security clearance notification pinged. Another level of access had been revoked. The investigation was moving faster than he'd feared. Lieutenant James Dorn's reflection stared back at him from the darkened computer screen, the service medallion's gleam now seeming more like a spotlight of shame than a badge of honor. The night settled over Fort Greystone, but for Lieutenant James Dorn, there would be no rest. The consequences of his actions were only beginning to unfold, and somewhere in the darkness, Specter 6 continued her vigilant watch, protecting even those who had doubted her all along. Lieutenant James Dorn's fingers traced the edge of his service medallion, the metal cold against his skin, in the pre-dawn darkness. Every shadow at Fort Greystone seems to mock him, now knowing what he knows about Shaw, about Specter 6. The weight of 15 years of prejudice sits heavy on his chest as he positions his unit for the morning patrol. The first shots crack through the air at 0547. Lieutenant James Dorn's world erupts into chaos as insurgents materialize from the morning mist. His men scatter for cover, but they're surrounded. The trap was perfectly laid, except for one detail the enemy couldn't have known about. "Sir, West Sector's completely cut off!" Private Martinez's voice crackles through the comm. Lieutenant James Dorn clutches his medallion tighter, his pride crumbling like ash, as he realizes they need her. They need Specter 6. As if summoned by his thoughts, Shaw emerges from the shadows. Lieutenant James Dorn watches transfixed as she moves with lethal grace. Each shot from her rifle finds its mark with surgical precision. The sound echoes with a distinctive rhythm. Tap, tap, pause, tap. The signature cadence that made Specter 6 a legend. "I was wrong about you." Lieutenant James Dorn whispers more to himself than anyone else. The medallion catches the first ray of dawn, throwing light across his face. All this time, the firefight intensifies. Through the chaos, Lieutenant James Dorn sees Shaw covering his men's retreat with the same dedication she showed during Operation Dust Light, the operation he'd used to judge her, never knowing she was its hero. His comm crackles with a familiar voice. "Colonel Rivers ordered us to abandon those civilians, Lieutenant, but Specter 6 went back. She saved them all while we followed orders like cowards." Lieutenant James Dorn's hands shake as he uploads a video message to the military command channel. "This is Lieutenant James Dorn, Fort Greystone. I was wrong about Specter 6, about Shaw, about everything. Truth." Specter. The sound of his medallion hitting the ground cuts through the gunfire as Lieutenant James Dorn makes his choice. He moves to Shaw's position, covering her 6 like he should have done from the beginning. Lieutenant James Dorn requesting permission to assist Specter 6. He calls out loud enough for everyone to hear. Shaw's slight nod is all he needs. Together they clear the west sector with the efficiency that makes his previous doubts seem absurd. Every motion proves why she earned her legend, why his prejudice was so desperately wrong. Type respect if you've ever had to admit you were wrong about someone. The battle ends as suddenly as it began, leaving Lieutenant James Dorn standing in the clearing, smoke his medallion forgotten in the dust. His phone buzzes. The video is trending. Truth for Specter is spreading through military channels like wildfire. His confession, his redemption broadcast for all to see. "I spent 15 years judging you," Lieutenant James Dorn says to Shaw as they secure the perimeter. 15 years letting my prejudice blind me to who you really are. I'm ready to set the record straight about Operation Dust Light, about everything." The sun rises fully over Fort Greystone, illuminating the truth Lieutenant James Dorn had refused to see for so long. His medallion lies in the dust, a symbol of the pride he's finally willing to surrender in service of something greater justice. Lieutenant James Dorn's polished service medallion catches the morning light as he watches Commander Shaw drill the newest recruits. The weight of it feels different now, not a symbol of authority, but a reminder of transformation. The rhythmic thud of boots against packed earth echoes across Fort Greystone's training grounds, each step marking time, like a metronome counting the distance between who he was and who he's become. Position. Shaw's command rings out, and Lieutenant James Dorn finds himself unconsciously straightening his own posture. He remembers how he once sneered at her presence, how his prejudices had blinded him to the truth that had been before him all along. The revelation of her identity as Specter 6 had shattered his world like glass, forcing him to rebuild his understanding piece by painful piece. "Sir." A young private approaches datapad in hand. "The quarterly efficiency reports you requested." Lieutenant James Dorn accepts them with a nod, noting how the supply depot's numbers have improved beyond even his exacting standards. Each line of data represents more than mere logistics now. It's evidence of what happens when leadership transcends ego. The memory of Operation Dust Light weighs heavily as he walks the perimeter of the training ground. Lieutenant James Dorn's fingers trace the edge of his medallion, remembering how he once used it as a shield to deflect change, to maintain the comfortable illusion of superiority. "I was wrong," he whispers to the wind words he once thought he'd never say. Commander Shaw approaches her own medals gleaming in the sun. "The new protocols are working well," she observes, and Lieutenant James Dorn feels a surge of pride, not in himself, but in what they've built together. The depot runs with unprecedented efficiency, every soldier trained to see beyond rank to the heart of true service. I never thought I'd say this. Lieutenant James Dorn admits watching the recruits move in perfect synchronization, but you've shown me what real leadership means. It's not about being seen, it's about seeing others. A social media alert catches his attention. The latest training video has gone viral. Warchuk Greystone transformed trending as viewers worldwide witness the change at Fort Greystone. Lieutenant James Dorn smiles, remembering how he once feared such exposure. Now he welcomes it. Let them see. Let them learn. The day ends with a ceremony. Lieutenant James Dorn, standing tall as Commander Shaw, awards commendations. His medallion rests in a display case alongside her recovered honors. No longer symbols of division, but testaments to growth. The sound of applause fills the air, but it's the quiet nods of respect from the troops that mean the most. Drop 3 if you believe in second chances. Scrolls across the screen as Lieutenant James Dorn's voice carries the final truth. True leadership isn't measured by the shine of our medals, but by the shadows we're willing to step out of to serve others. You saw the sun sets on Fort Greystone, casting long shadows across the training ground. Lieutenant James Dorn watches as Commander Shaw dismisses the troops, knowing that tomorrow will bring new challenges, new opportunities to prove that transformation isn't just possible, it's necessary. Share this story if you believe change starts with admitting our mistakes. Appears as Lieutenant James Dorn's final reflection echoes. Sometimes the greatest victory isn't winning the battle, it's learning to fight alongside those we once thought were the enemy. Lieutenant James Dorn gripped the classified files tighter, his knuckles whitening as he scanned through yet another heavily redacted document from Operation Dust Light. The black lines mocked him, concealing truths he knew existed beneath. His service medallion, usually a source of pride, felt unusually heavy in his uniform pocket, a constant reminder of his own decorated past that now seemed to mock him. "Another dead end," he muttered, tossing the file onto his growing pile of useless papers. But something about Evelyn Shaw's personnel file kept drawing him back. The gaps in her service record were too precise, too carefully crafted. No simple supply technician had records this clean, this deliberately sparse. Through his office window, he watched Shaw crossing the yard, her movements catching his trained eye. The way she scanned the perimeter, 3 points military precision just like he'd been taught in special operations. Her boots hit the concrete with a rhythm that sent chills down his spine. Tap, tap, pause, tap, tap, pause. The cadence of someone trained to move in hostile territory. His mind wandered back to his mentor, Colonel Harrison, who'd always said, "Power isn't about rank, James. It's about knowing what others don't want you to know." The colonel had helped shape Lieutenant James Dorn's career, teaching him how to maintain control through information. But now that very lesson was turning against him. Lieutenant James Dorn pulled up the base's security feeds, a habit he'd developed since Shaw's arrival. The footage showed her in the supply depot, but something was off. Her hands moved with the efficiency of someone who'd packed go bags under fire, not supply requisition forms. The whispers about Specter 6 had started 3 weeks ago. At first, Lieutenant James Dorn had dismissed them as base gossip. But now, watching Shaw through his surveillance feeds, each movement she made confirmed his growing suspicions. The way she carried herself, the subtle tells. It all pointed to advanced training far beyond her supposed role. His research had led him through military databases, each search hitting firewalls and classification levels that shouldn't exist for routine personnel files. Every blocked access, every redacted line, every dead end spoke volumes. The scientific studies on operational security patterns he'd reviewed showed clear indicators Shaw's behavior matched top-tier Spec Ops profiles with 97% accuracy. Lieutenant James Dorn reached for his service medallion, a nervous habit he'd developed recently. The metal felt cold against his palm, no longer offering the comfort it once did. A memory surfaced, his own training days when Colonel Harrison had said, "Sometimes the biggest threats wear the friendliest faces." The base's morning report lay open on his desk, Shaw's latest supply requisition form on top. But the numbers didn't add up. The quantities, the timing, it all aligned with preparing for a major operation, not routine base maintenance. Type secrets if you've ever felt your control slipping away. The surveillance feed caught his attention again. Shaw was speaking with Private Martinez near the communications building. Her stance was casual, but Lieutenant James Dorn recognized the subtle positioning, maintaining lines of sight, keeping her back protected. These weren't the habits of a supply officer. These were ingrained behaviors of someone who'd operated in the shadows. His own past in special operations now felt like a double-edged sword. He could see through her cover because he'd been trained to create them. Each perfectly maintained gap in her record, each carefully constructed explanation. He'd written reports like that himself, designed to hide truths in plain sight. The weight of realization pressed down on Lieutenant James Dorn's shoulders. If Shaw truly was Specter 6, everything he thought he controlled at Fort Greystone was an illusion. His authority, his power, his carefully maintained order, all built on shifting sand. The service medallion slipped from his trembling fingers, clattering onto his desk. The sound echoed in his office like an accusation. "Have you ever watched your certainty crumble?" He whispered to his reflection in the window, seeing fear in his own eyes for the first time in years. Operation Dustlight's shadows loomed larger now, threatening to engulf everything Lieutenant James Dorn had built. The very system that had given him power might now be his undoing. As he watched Shaw disappear into the supply depot, her steps still keeping that haunting Spec Ops rhythm, he realized the hunter might have become the hunted.